Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to another unit roster overview as we'll be taking a look at the Nurgle roster today. Now with only 14 units, the Nurgle roster is tied with Tzeentch for having the smallest number of units available at launch. And not only are there only 14 units, you can clearly see there are only 3 main types of units in the Nurgle roster, as we have the Infantry, the Monster and Beast, and the Missile Monster and Beast. So with that in mind, let's not waste any more time and jump in here and take a detailed look at all the units. And getting things started, we have the Nurglings, which are the cheapest infantry units within the Nurgle roster at 350. But except for being cheap, they're probably also the best animated units in the game, as you can see clusters of 10 small Nurglings making up each unit, and there are 60 of them making up the entire retinue. They have relatively small mass of 125, but pretty high health actually. They have absolutely no armor, and they will be your fodder units. Most of the defensive stat for Nurgling units are going to come from high health and also melee defense. Now in this case, as the cheapest unit, we're not going to have a lot of stats, but a common attribute for the entire Nurgle roster is going to be poison attack, which will reduce enemy attack by 15% and enemy speed by 15% when you deal melee damage against them. And you also have magical attack for the weapon type, since these are demon units. And speaking of demon units, we can look at the abilities here. They have the demonic trait, which means they will suffer damage when they are shattered or broken. And they will have a new ability here, unique to the Nurgle faction, called Cloud of Flies. And this will activate whenever you're in melee. You get a bonus 9 point of melee defense. It expires when you leave melee, but with a 15-second cooldown, and whenever you engage in melee again, it will recharge and you can use it again. These units also have Vanguard deployment and cause fear. Looking back at the stats real quick, the weapon damage on these are quite low, and most of it's going to be base damage, 24-4, the split, and this is going to be a pretty common trend. For the Nurgle playstyle, it's mainly about out-grinding your opponent with your high health and high melee defense, while doing pretty low damage to them, and you also be debuffing them with your poison to help ease your survivability, in essence, as you will slowly beat down the enemy just by outlasting them. And this kind of works with their army abilities as well, and these abilities will activate once you have accrued enough damage taken by your units, which is part of the reason why you're focused on sort of defense and high health rather than sort of just bypassing damage with armor or with super high melee defense. And that's going to do it for our Nurgling units. Then moving up to 750 cost, we have the Plaguebearers of Nurgle, which we see here are sort of your standard infantry unit. They have 100 per retinue with 150 mass. They finally have some armor stats, okay leadership, very slow speed, once again the poison and magical attack on the melee attack, pretty high melee defense, weapon damage with the main focus of being base. In terms of abilities, we are still demons. We still have Cloud of Flies, and for being a demon unit for the Nurgle roster, you will have 20% physical resistance, and pretty much every single unit among the Nurgle roster has cause fear, so that's going to be pretty standard. And once again, we have very high health. Moving up to 800 cost, we have the Forsaken of Nurgle, and this is a common unit among the Chaos Gods, and these are not going to be demon units. They're going to have actual high armor, not so much health anymore, 80 unit per retinue with a decent mass of 175 for infantry. They will still have poison, but their attack will not be magical since they're not a demon. Not much defense on these guys, nor will they have the Cloud of Flies. I think they're the only unit in the Nurgle roster without Cloud of Flies. Weapon strength is higher, but still mainly base damage. In terms of abilities, we can kind of focus on the offensive nature of these units with Frenzy. As long as we can keep leadership above 50%, we'll get 10% weapon damage boost, 10% additional charge, and 8 points of melee attack, as well as immune to psychology. And when this wears off, don't worry, because you'll always have immune to psychology. Slight duplication for the first half of your leadership, but if you dip below 50, you can still protect yourself with the regular immune to psychology here. They will still cause fear, and this is sort of a standard unit among most of the Chaos factions. Lastly, at 1250 cost, we have our elite infantry option here with Exalted Plaguebearers of Nurgle. And the one additional thing over their just improved stat is that they will have a small range component. They'll get 2 ammo of a projectile you can throw out before you charge into the fight. Only 70 range, so sort of firing this as you charge up. Missile strength is actually mainly armor piercing, 9/21 split with a decent reload time of 7.2 seconds to let you basically exhaust your ammo on the charge. Then you turn into just a slightly better version of the Plaguebearer with improved stats across the board. Still poison on all aspects of the attack, still mostly base damage for the weapon strength, 100 unit per retinue at 175 mass. In terms of abilities, we're back to being a demon, we're back to having Cloud of Flies for a little bit of defensive boost, as well as the 20% physical resistance. Still has Fear and Hide, and a lot of health. Moving on to Monster and Beast, we start with the Chaos Furies of Nurgle, costing at 550. This is once again a pretty standardized unit among the 4 Chaos Gods. Our version is going to be slightly different because we have Poison and a little bit of Cloud of Flies to make up for the low melee defense, but they're still very fragile units. They're very fast flyers. Think of them as light cavalry in the sky, good for chase down, not really good for long-term engagement. You're mainly targeting units that are shattered to prevent them from coming back. Not so much health, very light unit in terms of what they are as monsters, only 40 per retinue at 150 mass, and from all the stats, pretty obvious we're pretty much an offensive focused unit with low leadership, which is going to hurt them since they are demons. So if they shatter or break, they will start killing themselves with the banish and the instability. As a demon though, we'll still get 20% physical resistance. We have Vanguard deployment on top of Cause Fear. Then at 650 cost, we have the Plague Toad of Nurgle. These are war beasts for the Nurgle faction. They're basically giant toads that will leap onto enemy infantry as they are anti-infantry units. They will pretty much wreck them with collision and extra bonus damage against infantry. Only 7 points, but still a decent amount. Pretty high weapon strength, but once again focus on base damage with a 35-15 split. Good charge bonus for what they are. They have a decent amount of mass, 24 per retinue with 1200 mass here. Still with the poison effect, still with the magical attack effect here on the melee attack. And even though the melee defense is a little bit weak, you can shore that up with the Cloud of Flies. Speed is good. 59 is pretty decent for what they are. Obviously not as fast as some of the heavier shot cavalry, but still gonna allow it to catch up to infantry, which is its main target. Aside from having Cloud of Flies, we still are a demon with the same resistances, and we will also cause fear. Then at 800 cost, we have the Beasts of Nurgle, which is a single entity unit with regeneration. Now, if we look at the mass, it's actually pretty massive at 3,500 mass. Most single entities are pretty massive, but this is a pretty high number, and we're going to see some other pretty high number among the Nurgle faction as well later on. They have a decent amount of armor, pretty average leadership. Speed is okay at 40, melee attack, melee defense not super high, but you can see the slight focus on defense, especially since we still have Cloud of Flies to buff that up. Weapon strength is pretty high and finally focused on mainly armor piercing damage with a 100-200 split here. Charge bonus is pretty low, but the mass will definitely help us when we do charge into a cluster of units. In terms of abilities, we are a siege attacker, we will cause fear, we are demon, those are pretty standard. Cloud of Flies already mentioned. There are 3 unique ones here. With the regeneration, we will constantly heal at 0.1% per second, but we will increase our weakness to fire, so sort of fire cleansing the plague. We are a single entity, so we have Wound, which will weaken our base weapon damage and armor piercing weapon damage by 20%, and speed by 10% should we dip below 25% of our health points. And finally, we have Slime Trail, which will hex nearby units by reducing their melee attack by 5 points and speed by 10 points. And this sort of plays together with the debuffing enemy with poison and trying to slowly outgrind them. This lower their melee attack should be pretty useful actually. And we will still have the same 20% physical resistance for being a demon unit. Then at 900 cost, we have the Rot Flies, which is going to be our flying war beasts. There's only going to be 10 of them per retinue, 800 mass, not very high, not much armor, average leadership, good speed of 90 though. Mainly focus on attack, as you can see here with 31-24 split between the melee attack and melee defense, although defense can be shored up by 9 points, which will allow it to surpass melee attack once it do get into melee with the Cloud of Flies. Pretty interesting because these are flies as well. And then we have weapon strength of 80, with most of it being armor piercing, which is good, 25-55 split. In terms of abilities, we're looking at the standard setup, with the only bonus here being it can fly. So nothing to add here. Moving up to 1000 cost, we have the Pox Riders of Nurgle. You can think of these as upgraded versions of the Toad, as now they have a mounted Plaguebearer on top, and that's going to give it pretty much a little bit of stat boost across the board. It still functions as the same type of unit, 24 per retinue here with 1400 mass, average armor, average leadership, same speed as before with just the Toad, not getting weighed down by the extra man on top. Still the poison and magical attack, focus on defense, anti-infantry with the same bonus of 7, but higher weapon strength overall. I think the same charge bonus of 36 and the same passive ability here. So you're basically paying up a little bit extra for a little bit of extra stats across the board because you now have an extra attacker on top of them. They will still mainly charge into infantry clusters and use their mass and their collision to deal most of their damage, but I guess you're just paying up for a bit of extra stat on top of a little bit of visual effect bonus here. Then also at 1000 cost, we have the Spawn Nurgle, which is once again a shared unit among the Chaos rosters. Our version here is going to be pretty similar. Low armor, unbreakable unit with good mass, 16 per group with 1500 mass. Our bonus is just going to be we have extra poison on our attacks to debuff. Aside from that, the stats pretty similar to all the other spawns for the Chaos Gods. A very offensive focused unit here. We will also benefit from Cloud of Flies despite not being a demon unit here, which is good, but no physical resistance will still cause fear. We're unbreakable and we have Siege Attacker. Jumping up to 1300 cost, we have the Plaguebearers of Nurgle, and this is going to be the Rotfly upgrade with an extra Plaguebearer riding on top, very similar to the Toad upgrade we saw earlier. So just expect bonus stats across the board, slightly increased mass. These are still going to be 10 per retinue, but instead of 800 from just the Rotflies, we now move up to 900, and we're going to get bonus stats, across. We're still going to be focused on armor piercing damage, just a little bit higher damage than before because we now have a rider. Same abilities as the regular Rotflies, so nothing really to add here. And lastly, for our strongest monster and beast unit, as well as the most expensive unit in the Nurgle roster, we have the Great Unclean One. Of course, Kugoth the Plague Father is an Unclean One, legendary lord, and you can also get exalted versions of the Unclean One as regular lords to lead your armies, and you have the Great Unclean One to run your armies as a unit. So this is going to be a monster unit, a single entity with extreme mass, 7,000 mass. I think this is the highest number I've seen so far in the game. So you have a massive unit here that can charge in and dish out great amount of collision damage, and it's not terribly slow, 36 speed. Not much armor, good leadership, mainly focus on attack, but you have Cloud of Flies to shore up your defense, so both figures will be pretty decent. You're still poison, mainly focused on armor piercing here, 150 and 350 split for the damage. And the main thing about the Great Unclean One, like most miniature versions of the Lord for all the Chaos faction, is you have access to spells, and it's going to be on brand here. We have Stream of Corruption, which will be a tier-shaped offensive damage spell, and a Miasma of Pestilence, which will be a nearby hex that will reduce enemy melee attack by 24 points and charge bonus by 40%. So once again, the goal is to make the enemy attack weaker while giving ourselves extra defense from things like Cloud of Flies, and that way we can basically grind them out in long fights. Aside from that, we are a demon, we are a single entity, so we have wounds. There is one special trait called Children of Nurgle. This is sort of the special trait you find on all these Lord replacement as units, similar to how in the Tzeentch roster we saw Lord of Change have one that grant ward save whenever you're casting. This one grants regeneration for all the units on the field for 5 seconds for 0.2% per second, which means you get 1% heal whenever you cast, essentially for every unit on the field that you have. It's a pretty neat bonus, kind of plays into our lore of being decay, but also growth. We will have the 20% physical resistance. By being a demon here, we will cause fear and terror, which means we're also immune to both. And as I mentioned, we are a siege attacker. So not much else to add here. Then finally, we have one last category of units, which are missile, monster, and beast. And we start things off with the Plague Drone of Nurgle. Except for this one is the Death Head variant, which means it has range, and it's going to cost a bit more at 1600 cost. These units pretty much have a special range attack, which has 7 ammo that dishes out 30-60 split missile damage, with most of it being armor piercing, with a pretty fast reload time of 7.2 seconds. The range is rather low, but this unit as a whole is still a close range unit after the 7 ammo goes away. The ammo does carry poison as well as magic attack, so it's still going to be on brand for Nurgle faction with a poison effect. The melee damage component, also the same thing, and the weapon damage is going to be the same as the regular plague drone. So basically it's the plague drones plus the additional range damage. Nothing really new on abilities except for fire whilst moving. And finally, at 1900 cost, we have our Soul Grinder of the Nurgle type, and very much like the other Soul Grinders for the other Chaos God, it's a pretty standard unit that's pretty powerful with the range component as well. High armor, decent leadership, very fast, which is actually kind of surprising. The mass is very high, 4,000 mass, which used to be the highest number in the game until we saw the Great Unclean One at 7,000. Mainly focused on offense, but because we have Cloud of Flies, which is what makes our Soul Grinder kind of unique with the Cloud of Fly for defensive bonus as well as the poison effect, the rest are pretty standardized across the board. 450 weapon strength with most of it being armor piercing. I think this is the same for all Soul Grinders. The range component is a little different on certain types of Soul Grinders, but I think we have the default one, 15 ammo with the magical attack. Obviously R have poison as well. It's going to be a shot of 3 volleys. I think Tzeentch is the one with the unique range of 5 shots per volley, but it's going to be a slow reload of 14.4 seconds, most of it being armor piercing with a little bit of explosive damage as well mixed in at a very far range. Now in terms of abilities, we cause fear, terror, siege attacker, we are demon, we have the standard Cloud of Flies. We are a single entity, so wound will reduce our melee component of our weapon damage, but not our missile damage, so that's not going to get touched. We have the same standard resistances, and we still have pretty high health. And that's going to do it for our Nurgle roster overview. And even though there are 14 units, I think overall the Nurgle roster is pretty versatile with a nice mix of infantry, flying units. There's enough range unit in there, so it's not too lacking. They also use spells. So I think they're pretty shored up in terms of gameplay design and the theme of how you want to utilize them. You want to focus on getting up close to your enemy and utilize your high health and debuff to weaken the enemy and outlast them in combat, because you don't really necessarily have a lot of attack bonuses, but you can weaken the enemy attack enough and have enough health and defense to outlast them in a drawn out melee engagement. So that's kind of the main style. So while we might not have that many flying units or that many range units, it doesn't really play into our main style of getting up close to them and kind of disgust them, which is why all our units cause fear and kind of win out these long engagements. And losing health is not going to be an issue, because that's actually what's going to drive up our meter for our army abilities as mentioned earlier. So hopefully you enjoyed this unit roster overview, and if you like to see more faction previews and faction roster overviews and guides for Total War Warhammer 3 throughout this pre-release period, consider subscribing to the channel, as I'll be covering every single faction leading up to the launch of the game. So thanks again for watching till the end, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!